Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is in all kinds of states of turbulence. And something's happening with Facebook. That's interesting. Oh, and here comes Mark Mandica. Hey,
Sorry.
Mark.
Hey, I was on the wrong link. Good to see y'all.
Okay. That's okay. There's some kind of an issue with Facebook, but we'll just keep going because I can post it there later if it doesn't run there. This is Andy Revkin. This is the Sustain What webcast. This is about episode number 500 or so, and I started almost exactly 4 years ago in the early days of the pandemic, trying to make sense of the world through conversations where complexity and consequence collide, and that means it's been very busy 4 years. I've done, and now we're going to divert from the human world to the interface between humans and a remarkable class of vertebrates, that the amphibia, which can be sort of invisible. They're literally mostly under our feet. There was a really successful movie a couple of years ago called Don't Look Up, and I think we should definitely look down, which is what my guests do a lot of, to try to understand the importance of and threats to salamanders, frogs, newts, and some other toads and some other oddities that that are within that same class. And you're going to hear today from wonderful biologist Karen Lips at the University of Maryland, who's been digging in for decades on, yeah, it has to be for multiple decades now, on the perils facing these animals. And Megan Hollingsworth, who's a poet, a writer, and deeply devoted to conservation of amphibians and of the living world generally. And Mark, I forgot to ask you how you pronounce your last name. Is it Mandica or Mandica or?
It's Mandica.
Mandica. Okay. You look like you're spelunking right now. You're in a very dark place.
I am in a hole right now. Yes. Sorry. I like it dark. What can you say?
That's okay. No, it's kind of cool. It's very appropriate, actually. And I wanted to show a couple of things here first. We're going to get back to that. This has been a long journey for me. I think I used to get this green printed newsletter called Frog Log when I was in the early days of environmental journalism in the early 90s. And I don't know if one of you was involved with creating it back at that time. And I think the early sense of the peril there, certainly ozone depletion and through the CFCs and was somehow implicated in some of the early ideas of what was going on with frogs. We'll talk about the array of threats, but others have come to the foreground more recently. It's certainly land use change, meaning draining wetlands, creating human habitation in the surge toward 9 billion of us. Climate change, increasingly, climate variability. Climate can change locally also, through deforestation and of course, global climate change now. And then diseases that weren't really understood. And people were seeing the vanishing happening and not really understanding fully what was going on. And Karen's been deeply involved in that as well. We're going to talk about a book and hear some poetry. And I thought I wanted to go back to one little thing to introduce a really key moment for me as a journalist came in 2016 or so. And Mark, you were directly involved in this. So let me just go to present, share screen. There was a Rab's fringe-limbed tree frog, one of only 2 left in the world. There was Atlanta Zoo and Botanical Garden.
Correct.
Tuffy was at the Botanical Garden, if I have this right.
Yes.
And you were working there.
I got to know him. He was already there when I met him. But yes, I spent about 7 years with him.
With Tuffy.
Yeah.
And Karen, maybe you could just briefly talk about fringe-limbed tree frogs before I'm going to play a little clip here.
Yeah, so I don't know that I ever got to see or meet Tuffy in person, but I worked at sites where his relatives, his family would have been, and it was at that place where we found the dead frogs, and it was sort of from that site, I believe, that Tuffy was collected and rescued from this epidemic that was going on in the frogs.
And I remember these stories about how rapidly that was happening. Just kind of could you just describe what that absence felt like as a biologist working in those forests?
It was, to this day, it was incredibly fast and shockingly how fast it actually happened, where I would go to a site and I would return the next year when the semester ended and things would be gone. And in this particular case, this site in central Panama, we came back in the summer and things were fine. And then as soon as we left to go back home and teach, the grad students who were still working there called us to say that frogs had begun dying. And basically in a period of something like 5 months, the entire system just collapsed. There were hundreds of dead frogs every day. And within 5 months, there was, down to a fraction of what was there. And things continued to decline over time, but it was really like this intense, just massive die off instantly in less than a year.
So here's Tuffy this is the recording I believe you made, Mark. Is this correct?
Yeah.
So let's just listen for a second.
Oh,
Keith Hughes, is that right?
This is the second recording that Keith got.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to pause it.
Well, if I can, he just was able to capture this bit of what I call the warm-up or pre-call of Tuffy, and seeing as there's only 2 recordings that I think exist, it's really special that he got that, because I had come in the middle of his call and tried to just record the tail end of it.
Wow. Well, let me just play this through. I did edit this at one point with including some of context that Karen was just talking about. So this must have been really hard. It's extinction usually happens in kind of a statistical way out in the bush. So we'll just go around here because Megan's book also deals with this. What should people be thinking about the fungus that tore through that region and still is an epic risk? And we're going to talk about some of the other pathogens, but I remember I interviewed Joe Mendelson after he wrote an essay on going into herpetology, feeling like it was a living science and feeling more like it was becoming like paleontology. And that was kind of a hard thing for me to hear as a journalist. So let's just talk a little bit about the feelings that emerged at that time. So Mark, starting with you.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of things that came to my mind when I was an undergraduate and I had first learned that you could actually possibly have a career studying amphibians. It's all I wanted to do. That's when it was in the late 90s, and we had a guest lecturer, Andy Blaustein, who talked about possible UV and holes in the ozone impacting amphibian and amphibian deformities. and that was really startling. Um, yeah, but I was mostly focused on just learning everything I could about amphibians. I went to school for more basic biology, but as time progressed, and especially when I became a parent, and it's literally more difficult for my son to find a frog than it is for me at the same sites, and I just got more engrossed in conservation until in 2016 when we started the Amphibian Foundation, which is very squarely in the conservation circles, for a lot of the same reasons that Joe mentioned. It seems like it's becoming an all hands on deck situation, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
And where are you located in the world? Where do you work?
In Atlanta is where the Amphibian Foundation is located, and we focus primarily on the Southeast.
Which is there's a lot to work on there, obviously.
There is, and the main ecosystem, the longleaf pine, is in itself endangered, and so there are so many species that are reliant on that ecosystem, and it's put a lot of pressure, uniquely on these southeastern amphibians.
Wow. And Megan, you have a book out, and I'm going to show some slides with images from it in a minute. But what brought you to this arena? Tell everyone a little bit about your background as a writer, and why you're focused on frogs and amphibians.
When Tuffy died in 2016, I was still devoted full time to a project called Extinction Witness, and I'd been writing for some time. I'd done a revolving witness focused on different groups, and well, let me go to my childhood, because this is the book came forward with children in mind, but is also accessible to adults, and adults have benefited from reading it and learned from it. And I learned a lot from producing Frog Song. But as a child, one of my visual memories is playing with a toad, holding toads in my backyard. And they're probably the only wild, other than fireflies, and I could cry, but wild animals that I've held that we can contact. They seem not to be, they seem to be okay with the contact, and so it allows that a real intimacy that we often don't get unless we stun an animal, and take them down and knock them out. We don't get that contact often directly. And the book too, the book came to form. The poem was written in 2016. As I share at the end of it, the last lines of the poem came to me first, and they came to me during a Remembrance Day for Lost Species, which Mark has also participated in. It was started in the UK, and I was doing a ceremony for Remembrance Day, and the lines of the poem came to me, and as I opened my eyes, I saw the frog on the Manduka, I believe it is, yoga mat, and those lines were then integrated in the poem for Tuffy, because I was aware that he had passed. And for me, this there are these individuals that we've gotten to know who are the last of their kind, or believed to be the last of their kind. Rab's fringe-limbed tree frog is not listed as extinct, because there's the possibility yet that we could find another member of the species out there, which provides more urgency to protect the areas where they could be. And I'll let Karen and Mark speak more to that. But that's how I came to this, and I produced the book really as a gift for my dad, who is a retired physician, and it's dedicated to my father, I should say. And he had a frog room for kids when I was growing up in his private practice. He had a frog room, no live frogs, no captive frogs, but lots of different figures of frogs. And he wore a frog in his doctor's coat. And
Interesting.
yeah, so he was known as the frog doctor.
That's fascinating. Well, and we'll hear a little bit of the poem in a bit. And now we'll swing back to the science and the threats. This is from amphibians.org. It kind of breaks down current thinking on the scope of the different sources of risk for amphibians. Karen, maybe you could just kind of talk through a little bit about that. And I'm going to bring up a couple of examples of some recent studies.
Yeah, I'll give a sort of an overview. I liked how you started with Frog Log, which started sometime in, I think, the late 80s, and was really sort of the collection of evidence at the very beginning where, scientists really did not know what was happening. The only thing they could say is frogs seem to be disappearing at these places that seem to be protected, we know are conserved, and they were disappearing. And so it started that conversation. What could it be? Is it one thing? Is it many separate things that are affecting them, these many dispersed places around the world? And as you said, in the early days, there was a lot of focus on UV and pollution. I would say the one constant has been habitat loss. I mean, there's no degradation. I mean, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that has always been the number one problem. It continues to be the number one problem. And in somewhere in the 1990s, it was, it became clear that, well, there's a lot of protected areas that they're losing amphibians as well. And we started looking at, as you said, some of the more invisible things. And where I entered the story as a grad student, I basically ran into a die-off while it was happening, and there were dead frogs on the ground. And we picked them up and sent them to a lab they were able to actually look and see what had killed the frogs. And that was the discovery then, along with our Australian colleagues and people here at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., that there was this weird thing in the skin that turned out to be this fungus, this thing we're going to call BD. And it then became a known factor in declines. People started looking for it. And there's been now a lot of studies where people have gone out into the field, gone to museums, and done retrospective studies to figure out what's going on. And so that was added to this list of threats. Climate change has always been in the mix. The question has always been to what degree and in what places. And I think it's thought that it's going to become even more of a threat as time goes on, as the planet continues warming and hydrology gets affected and the water evaporates, that frogs will be affected with additional problems. So it's sort of been this constant onslaught. The strength of the factors kind of changes with time and as our knowledge improves, but all of these things continue to be somewhat of a problem, and some way more than others.
Yeah, and these are two papers that just recently came out. One is drawing on, these are big, well, one of them is a big survey, the Global Amphibian Assessment. There's a name for it, right? The
GAA, the Global Amphibian Assessment, exactly.
Oh, I got it right.
You got it.
And that chart, it's a little hard. People can look at this later, and I'm going to post it on Substack on my Sustain What thing there with the links to the papers and stuff. But they have an interesting kind of a visual way to look at that map where the different colors are different sources of risk in different places. And one thing you do see is that there's something going on everywhere, pretty much, except in the high Arctic or Antarctica, but or just when you can't see the scale. Australia has problems, obviously. We're going to talk about those in a minute. One thing that I wanted to bring up is sort of, I've learned in studying a lot of the reporting I've done in more recent years on social sciences talks about things like recency bias, and where we get into our head a certain sense of what's challenging the environment, and that becomes the focal point for when a new thing emerges. I think when I think back to that early ozone moment, it's because the ozone layer was in our heads.
That's right.
And well, it has to be something driving this. And Karen, I know you and I have talked about climate change and some of the amphibian losses, particularly in Central America, where there were some early papers positing it was global warming. Global warming was and it is a hot subject, and some of that work didn't hold up. So how hard is it as a scientist to keep everybody focused on what the data are saying, as opposed to what's sort of in our heads?
Oh, it's something we all have to be aware of. And again, because things are changing so quickly on the planet, I mean, I think it becomes even more important to say, all right, well, yesterday we didn't think it was a huge problem, but at the rate at which things are changing, we have to, I think, sort of constantly reevaluate what we know and what we think we know, and be aware that because things are changing so quickly, it could be that what was not a problem yesterday will be a great problem tomorrow. And this figure that you show here, if you go and you look at the data, they nicely separate out the threats to amphibians in 2 time zones, like the early years and then the current years. And in that comparison, you can see that based at least on the data that are available, what were threats in certain areas in the early days are either less of a threat or more of a threat today, and there are new threats appearing. And I think it's climate change was the one that I noticed that really stood out in the recent and future years. You're starting to see evidence that climate change is affecting certain areas of the world, the frogs there, where it was not a problem in the early days. So.
And I want to switch over to the salamander side of the equation in a minute. But talk about fungi, whether it's salamander or frog. What is it about? I think we all we all have it in our head that moist fungi live in the moist, ugly parts of our toes or the world generally. So, but why are fungi such a big deal here? And then we're going to dive into salamanders.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great work recently on these pathogenic fungi, these chytrid fungi that are the group of fungi that are affecting the amphibians. And what's important to know is in the early days, not so long ago, we kind of called them the frog chytrid and the salamander chytrid as if they were 2 things. And in fact, the first one that was discovered, BD, it can infect pretty much all amphibians as far as we know. The more recent discovery, the salamander fungus, we now know actually infects frogs as well. So the problem is that both of them are generalists, and because they can infect so many different types of amphibians, any amphibian can probably transmit one of these things to many other amphibian species. And so it's not like a disease that typically just affects one species and you can sort of contain it to that one species and take measures. When all amphibians are susceptible, then you have to sort of realize that any one frog or salamander can transmit its infection to another one. So that's sort of the current understanding of these chytrid fungi.
And let's talk about the pet trade. Which is, I think you and I, the last time I interviewed you, or several times I've interviewed you, they're not just about pets, but about amphibians moving around the world, bringing these pathogens with them potentially. And we're now poised for, in North America, for particular, the scope of risk here is really extraordinary. Risk being a function of exposure, like how many things are in the way, and then vulnerability.
Yeah.
In this case, do you have any experience with this fungus? And then with what can you do about that? And I guess it's kind of scary to me, but I wanted to, so tell us about the dynamics of moving these animals around so much and how that relates to what could happen here.
Right. And so
you can jump in on this too.
Yeah. And so there was some work early on, because we sort of wondered, well, why is it that we're just starting to see these big die-offs in where I was working in Central America? And a couple years later, there was a bunch of geneticists who worked, and they basically got these different cultures of these fungi, and they were able to sort of trace the origins back and their relationships, and basically determine that if you went to the live animal trade, whether it's pets or food items or whatever, oftentimes they're all packaged in the same shipment. And so you can have a bunch of different frogs and salamanders from many parts of the world, all in a small container that's being shipped to another place on the planet. And if one of them is sick with one of these fungi, of course, then they can transmit it to the other ones that are in that package. And then when they get to the pet store or wherever they land, now they're potentially all infected. The container's infected, the water's infected. And if you're not aware and treat that, then you can actually inadvertently release it into a new environment. And that's sort of how we think that this chytrid got around. If you look at the genetics, it looks like both of them came somewhere out of Asia. The timeline's somewhere perhaps in the 1950s. And it spread through the trade because we're so connected, and we're connected so quickly these days that we can move things around, and the fungus remains viable in that time. And the key thing about here in North America that you've sort of hinted at is that while we do have this one type of chytrid here, the original one, BD, and it infects lots of our animals and is causing problems, North America, in particular where Mark is located there in the Southeast, is the world's global biodiversity hotspot for salamanders. There are more families and species of salamanders in the southeastern United States than anywhere else on the planet. And what we don't have here yet is that second chytrid, the salamander chytrid we call it, which we know is highly lethal for many types of salamanders. And so our fear here in North America is that it will arrive here and cause problems. And so there's a ton of people keeping an eye out and doing what they can to prevent the introduction of it, which is hard because it's somewhat invisible because it's a microscopic fungus. So maybe Mark has something to add there.
Yeah, well, and maybe the first thing, Mark, I would love to get your input and Karen's on why is southeastern United States evolutionarily in the history of life on Earth, what made this part of the world a hotspot for biodiversity? When I think of biodiversity hotspots, I think of Ecuador, Yasuni Park, and so what's the story here? What's known about why this is such a hotspot for diversity?
I can, sure. I mean, the climate is very conducive to a lot of these things, but also the Appalachian Mountains just have had quite a direct impact on like speciation across the lungless salamanders. The most diverse group of salamanders in the Southeast, there's not a lung between them. They're all lungless, and they're really diverse and they're incredible. And so they've been restricted to a lot of mountains where the mountains poke up, and they like it cool, so they don't go down the mountain. So a lot of these montane species are it's very, very specious in that area. I work in the coastal plain, which is also a very biodiverse place for salamanders for different reasons. I think it's just the climate's very conducive. If you go a little further south, you get to Miami, where obviously any reptile or any amphibian can live there forever because there's so many invasives. So that's Karen, you have anything to add to that? I just did a broad brush there.
Yeah, I was, because, I think like Andy, most people, when you hear biodiversity, you think the tropics. And when you look at this map on the screen, you don't see many salamanders in the tropics. And so to get to the sort of the original source of this diversity, if you think back to plate tectonics, the salamanders were kind of in that northern temperate plate. And so it split apart. They diversified up there. So you see that they're in North America. And it's only been recently that they've been able to basically walk through the isthmus of Central America into South America. So those are all recent fairly recent movements over, geologic time, of course.
Yeah. Which gets to me again, it's not like I have sleepless nights about this because I'm thinking about so many other things from the Ukraine war onward. But I do think about this once in a while, the idea, and what are we doing or not doing? I just was reading a paper about the limits of what's happened so far with American policy on preventing that journey, or at least mitigating the chances of that journey of that fungus happening. I don't know who here is most, up to date on the policy question.
Well, the last I heard, it was right before the pandemic, where U.S. Fish and Wildlife put in a rule that prevented the import of salamanders that had been shown to be infected with this salamander chytrid to be imported into the U.S. That went into place, and it is still in place. The reality is that the way our rules are set for injurious wildlife is you have to list the injurious animal, not the disease, because that's how the law was originally written back in like 1900. And so the world has changed quite a bit since 1900, and we don't actually have a particular law that would allow you to just say, okay, you can't do anything that might allow the inadvertent introduction of BD and B-Sal. And so we're currently at that stage. If a salamander has been shown to be infected with these, you cannot bring it in. If it is infected, you can clean it and treat it and then bring it in. But I think that's sort of the state of the art at this point. Mark, do you know any updates on that?
I do. I know a little, just that there's some real holes in being able to screen properly for what's coming into the country. It's not easy or cheap to do all that testing, and so I feel like it's essential. I was involved a little bit in that the Lacey Act decisions on the B-Sal task force, which is a North American group trying to keep an eye out on this stuff. And I'm not a disease biologist. I joined just to try to help with communication because I just wanted to feel like I was doing something. But even though it's, there are still some imports, there's lacking ability to screen these things properly.
Yeah, we have the tests, but as Mark says, it's expensive and you need the equipment. And while that might not be a problem here in the United States, you sort of want to have things tested before it actually gets here. And that's where things get a little tricky because, there's a lot of wildlife diseases that are out there, and it's not just the salamanders that we care about. We care about inadvertent introductions of all sorts of diseases. And I kind of had thought that when we went through the pandemic, which, was the spread of disease around the world, that it might sort of serve as a lever to really bring the attention on diseases and to put in greater measures to prevent any sort of disease coming into areas where it's not native, whether it's wildlife disease, human disease, agricultural disease. So we do have, the Agricultural Service, USDA, has a team of basically veterinarians who work to inspect our agricultural animals and plants. As Mark indicated, the USGS has the Amphibian Research and Monitoring Initiative, ARMI, which is currently working across all the United States to keep an eye out for die-offs and have sort of an early warning system in case something does appear. They can step in and try and take some measures. So there's definitely people out there doing their best, but there's a concern whether or not it will be fast enough or enough.
One thing I hadn't thought of until just now is I know this was the case with the Central American frogs and toads, getting them into captivity as a way to sort of create an arc. Is that happening with our North American amphibians already as a sort of a backstop, just in case?
Mark?
I can, yeah, sure. I could say that we started the Amphibian Foundation in 2016 as a mechanism to start an assurance colony for a particular species that was considered or is considered at imminent risk of extinction. And so, when you're getting to the point where you're actually removing animals from the wild to stop their imminent extinction, that's already well past, and it's pretty bleak, is what I'm saying. That's a dramatic thing to do. We have a few hundred of these flatwood salamanders at our facility in Atlanta, from the 3 last known sites on the planet that are known to still be occupied by these things. Oh, thank you. Yeah, if you go to research and click on the frosty that's at the top there, flatwood salamanders.
Yeah.
You can at least see how pretty they are, and we've touched on this topic, and I'll bring it up here, is that, we're trying to conserve a species that no one's ever heard of and are likely to never see. And it's really hard to get people pumped about that, and Karen made that point too, that, maybe this would act, the pandemic would act as a lever. I can say that when Tuffy died, The Guardian put out an article that the headline was "Frog Goes Extinct, Media Yawns." That was the name of it. It's just like, it's really hard to break through and get what's happening with these amphibians, which are beloved to everyone here, up into the public awareness space has been a real challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to talk about the communication stuff again in a second, including the poem, but also the New York Times op docs. Somehow you got connected with some very creative filmmakers to get at this. This question of species that are hidden and not charismatic. Well, they are charismatic, I think.
They're very charismatic.
Yeah, you can't argue with that. Look at it.
No, I know. I hadn't heard of this particular species. What an amazing animal we're looking at here.
Yeah.
But it does create this takes me back to Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, his strategy, which is distinct from this issue of global pathogens, unfortunately, was just to conserve a lot of space. Let's set aside enough terrain. He had half Earth, half of terrestrial space, and I think they're trying to do a third of the oceans. So there's some flexibility. There's plasticity. There's places for the hidden wonders to be sustained. Because maybe it's just really hard to build a picture, a prism of possibilities like this. I think one thing I like here in North America, we'll get to some solutions in a minute, is the big night, which is coming up in the temperate zones, at least where I'm in Maine, in another few weeks. Everyone in North America, and probably I assume in Europe, there's these mini migrations that happen, and there are roads and there are perils, and people can get directly involved in that. But I want to get back to the poem and the film. So maybe we'll start with the poem. Let me just change my screen here a second. Hold on. And thanks for dealing with any of the technical issues. It's just there's no producer behind the scenes. Just little old me pushing buttons. Yeah, maybe this will work. Oh, whoops, hold on one second. So Frog Song. Megan, we were thinking maybe you could do a little bit of a narration, a little bit of your work.
Yeah, so I can read the poem. The slides that we'll see are samples of the illustrations that Bonnie Gordon Lucas did for the book. And before I start reading, I want to thank Bonnie for working with me on this. She jumped right in. She knows my parents and was really excited to work on this project. And she was very gracious in that she was willing to work with some photos, to create some of the illustrations from photos, including the cover which is an illustration of Robin Moore's photo of a Amazon gladiator frog. And that is also included in the poem. It's the last image in the poem. And then also Joel Sartor's photo of Tuffy is also included in here. And Bonnie typically, she creates her own. She's very imaginative, and you definitely explore the rest of her work. Just wanted to say that gratitude, and also to, I'm not sure how much more of the book we're going to get into, but to all of you really for contributing. And Andy, you may not be aware of this, but your film and recording of Tuffy is one that the map that we'll see later on, the map illustration was taken from that, and an article that Karen published. And Mark was so generous with his time on this as well. As I mentioned, the poem was written first in 2016, and they put it to the book starting in 2022. So I'll go ahead and read, Andy, and you can change the slides as you feel see fit. Okay. There was a girl who once fed a tree frog who lived in a glass cage. He was the last known tree frog of a certain kind, with bulging eyes that told the girl a story about free falling to escape danger, and how a fungus like poison can outfox the smartest designs. Together they sang songs until the frog died with the girl by his side. He was one of a kind. The girl still sings their songs. And though she may not get to meet the one she calls, or see the tree holes where tadpoles grow, her songs give birth to the first tree frog of a certain kind. Death is not real. Death is not real. Death is not real. The love song eternal. So maybe if you could switch back to, well, we can go to the map. A lot of comments, I'll say, have been made on a lot of discussions with children. They've been discussing death, and so the book it does include a section on how we respond to mass extinction. You know, the big death that Tuffy's story is a part of. And like you, Andy, I'm immersed in my education is interdisciplinary. So the book, in terms of the homework that's included, the conservation homework is very broad. It's not necessarily focused on amphibians, and that comes from, I'm with E.O. Wilson as well. We know what to do. We know that everyone needs home and food. And the best way to provide that is to protect the habitat when we're speaking of wildlife. So, and humans benefit too from that protection. We mutually need, we can go to the spiritual need, but then the basic need for that physical interaction, as I mentioned, with holding the toads and knowing who is part of our community is really vital for us. So beyond the food and the basics, clean water, everything else, it's all really connected. So.
Yeah, and Karen, and thank you for that. It was beautiful, and it is beautiful. I recommend people check out the book. And I think that the website, as I was showing, is frogsongbook.com, I think.
Correct. Yeah.
Karen, could you talk a little bit more, just flash back to this journey that the pathogen made and what happened through that stretch?
Yeah, this is the map that you had showed earlier in a more beautiful format. I started working as a grad student. Up in the top of that map is Costa Rica, and then the sort of the right hand part in yellow and green is Panama. And in Costa Rica, really one of the most famous disappearances in the earliest of days was the golden toad from Monteverde. And that's, I think, that first dot up there in 1996, where it just disappeared from a protected area. I started working in right there along the Costa Rica-Panama border as a grad student up in the mountains in, again, another protected international park. And one day after a couple of years, I went back and the frogs had disappeared. And again, because you're in a park in the middle of nowhere, the usual suspects are not there. You can't collect all the frogs. There's no habitat loss. And basically, then my career has been working in all those sites as you go further east into Panama, setting up, a camp and running transects where we would go out with my students and we would count the frogs and the snakes and the lizards and study them and figure out what they did there and estimate their abundances. And basically, we would wait for the fungus to appear. We weren't sure that it would appear. We had one site where we invested the most amount of time, and after something like 12 years of us studying the frogs, it appeared. And that was where we documented that 5 months of sort of mortality. The frogs died. And because we had been there ahead of time and we had certain predictions, we said, well, we think it's moving from Costa Rica sort of south and eastward. And so in that time, we were able to sort of mobilize the scientists. We went out there and people studied the streams, the insects, the frogs, the snakes, so that we could understand if this thing did appear and it wiped out the frogs, what would be the impact on the ecosystem, right? Because even when the frogs disappear, there are other top-down effects, bottom-up effects on other parts of these habitats. And in the end, we were able to show a variety of, basically everything was affected in some way. And one of our most recent papers, we actually were able to show that for about almost 10 years in Costa Rica and then in Panama, there was an elevated level of malaria in the people living closest to where those frogs disappeared. And so we make the case, yet to be proven with experiments, that the frog loss probably meant that there was greater insects, particularly mosquitoes, and the amount of disease in people then went up. So, we thought this would be really important in really helping make the case, as Megan just said, we are all connected. And it's important to have the amphibians there, the snakes there, because not only are they awesome, but our survival and our livelihood depends on this as well. And so there's a lot more that as scientists do more work, we'll see more and more how important biodiversity and nature is to people.
Absolutely. I'm showing, this must be a link to, was one of your colleagues from UC Davis, or is this another study?
Yeah, that's Mike. He and his team actually did the analysis and worked with Roberto Ibanez and I. Roberto's in Panama there at the Smithsonian. And we're able to use our data and the health data that Mike got from the ministries of health of both Costa Rica and Panama. So it was truly an international multidisciplinary approach to really try and understand what does it mean when the frogs disappear to the people living in those communities.
Well, I want to get back to both Mike and to Megan a little bit more before we close, but I want to shift to the Op Docs film. The Op Docs section of the Times is really interesting. When I did my .earth blog, it was for the opinion side of the paper, and it must be 8 or 10 years ago now they started these little filmmaking sort of films as opinion pieces, and I think they're really, really interesting. And so tell us a little bit about this, and then I'm going to play just a little section of it. How did this happen? Who are the people who worked with you?
This is an incredible film, and I give total credit to Moby Docs, which is the name of a film production company in Germany. And the German government funded them to do this story. They do a lot of TV shows on nature and nature documentaries. And they had read Elizabeth Colbert's book about the sixth extinction and thought, what a fascinating story. Let's go do something. They called me up out of the blue, came to DC. We went out to Shenandoah National Park and caught some salamanders, and we talked about salamanders. And then they interviewed me and said, well, we're going to go back and make a film. Well, the pandemic hit a couple months later. They weren't able to travel or do, filming. But this artist named Volker Schlechter did all the art here. And he works with them on many of their films. And he spent apparently 2 years during the pandemic listening to me talk in the headphones from that interview. And he created this film, this animated documentary that they then put into the film festivals. It premiered at the Berlinale in Berlin last February. It's won a lot of awards because the artistry is just incredible. And when you watch it, you really, I personally even felt differently than just listening to me drone on about the data, which, I value the data incredibly, but watching this art film really, I thought, struck an even different chord. And my scientist friends thought the same. It just really, I think, brings it home in a different way that the data itself doesn't really make that connection. And I think both you and Megan both kind of emphasized, a conversation and the feelings and the connection that you have makes it feel more powerful than data do, I think. So.
And did it feel uncomfortable working with artists, or did it just, was time required? What was the trust factor that went into this?
Well, these guys, I mean, I've been super lucky and have been able to work with all sorts of just incredibly gifted people from all walks of life, whether they're journalists or artists or scientists. And, I didn't have any worries. Maybe I should have, but I guess I've had good luck in having people really care about the frogs and care about the story and try and tell the story as clearly and as correctly as they can. And I just, I did very little here other than that original interview, which is the narration in the background.
I could turn up the sound a little bit just so people get a little bit of the vibe too. Hold on a second.
And see, just these little jewels, to walk these streams and hear them calling, and you hear this incredible diversity. It's like a symphony. And then to go back a year later, maybe, and it's silent. It's totally quiet. And it's so weird. When the dinosaurs died out, there were frogs, and somehow they survived this event that wiped out giant
Sorry, I'm not quite sure.
T-Rex and Brontosaurus. The estimate is somewhere between 150 and maybe 200 species have gone extinct in the past 2 or 3 decades. 41% of all amphibians are in decline. And that's worse than any other group of animals on the planet. I mean, there's certainly the harlequin frogs, Adelopus. These are beautiful, bright-colored toads that live in streams, almost completely eliminated around the globe. Then there's the beautiful little glass frogs, Ranas de cristales. You can see their green bones through their clear skin and watch their heartbeat. And they live on the leaves over the streams. There's the frog I studied for my dissertation, and it's called Isthmohyla calypsa, and it's that spiny green frog. There was the golden toad, the famous golden toad from Costa Rica that completely disappeared. I'll end on one that's my Twitter avatar, which is Gastrotheca cornuta. And this is a big frog. He lives in the top of the trees, and he's got horns over his eyes. So it looks like he's got 2 horns coming out of his head. And they have a call that sounds like the popping of a champagne cork.
Amazing. It definitely adds a dimension to the story of these amphibians to have artistry in the mix, along with poetry, like the book. I wanted to close out with a look at some of the optimism possibilities. You know, a lot of this is pretty tough. There is a certain sense of, I won't use the word inevitability, but I'm hinting at it in terms of the North American threat. So I wanted to ask you, what gives you action points? I'm not going to say hope. Hope is a weird word. What can people do? To me, I do think, as I said earlier, the big night, the work, it seems very local and incremental, but I think it has a lot of value to help frogs and salamanders across roads. There's some science though too as well. Let me see if I can pull that up. This is just really recent stuff. An Australian effort to preserve the green and golden bell frogs seems to be working. They've created these refuges which protect them from introduced fish and from chytrid, at least theoretically. So what else is out there that's giving you some sense of what people can do and why not to get into sort of woe is me mode? Maybe Mark, and then Karen, and then we'll close with another thought or two from Megan.
Thank you. Yeah. One thing we've been able to do, at least regionally at the Amphibian Foundation, is just try and provide opportunities for people to get involved regardless of their background or interest level or capacity. And so we have some community science programs here in Atlanta on amphibian monitoring. There's also the Frog Watch, which is a national program where people can contribute observational data to a larger data set. And so those are some ways that are easy to get involved. But there's really unlimited ways. Like anyone that comes to in Atlanta that comes and wants to do something, there's plenty of things that need to be done and need to be done promptly. And so it's just the challenge is connecting with as many people as we can. And then even though it takes a lot of work to facilitate these programs locally, we're trying to expand those out and just really connect with people that are paying attention and are passionate about these slimy underdogs.
Underfrogs. So the undertoad of John Irving's book. I had never thought about that. So Karen, too, maybe I don't know if you're tracking this particular science study, but there are things going on with chytrid, understanding it better, even not really a vaccine, but other approaches. So what else is out there that gives you stuff to do?
Yeah, I mean, I would put in a plug for habitat for sure, right? Buying up more land and protecting it is always a good thing, not just for the frogs, but for everything else. Like Mark, I think citizen science is going to be key, because what it does is it gets lots of people, the citizens of the world, involved. And there's this incredible app that Jodie Rowley in Australia has developed called Frog ID, that the entire country of Australia is using it, and they're able to map out by frog calls what they're hearing, and they're discovering new species and extending the range. It's incredible, and people are eating it up. It's kind of like the Merlin, if you know the Merlin app for birds here. It's like the Merlin app for frogs of Australia. And I think we need a Merlin app for frogs here in North America, because I think what it would do is really allow people to connect to our own wildlife and really start plotting it. Of course, people are using iNaturalist for recordings of the observations themselves. But I think if we had one for the calls, that could also sort of extend the iNaturalist world into the calls. And I think they are working on that. So I think bringing in the citizens, the kids through these films and books and apps like this is really going to help us understand what's going on, get people involved, because, people care. We do care. They just don't really know what it is they can do to fix the problem, because we don't actually know either. So
I'm showing one tiny example of the Big Night movement in Maine. There's MainBigNight.org. Again, this is where I live now, and I had no idea the salamander activity was that great up here. I grew up in Rhode Island further south, and in the Hudson Valley, we were surrounded by newts, eastern newts, and I have some wonderful video of them. But virtually anywhere in the temperate zones, I think, when you're coming out of winter, there's a possibility to do this kind of thing. Mark, maybe you could just quickly touch on that last thing. I know we talked about this earlier.
I'd be delighted, because I went to school at UMass, which is down the road from the country's first salamander crossing, and where they actually built a culvert under the road to facilitate spotted salamander migration. And, there used to be signs, but everybody, would steal the sign. They were actual road signs that said salamander crossing. Drift fences are put up to guide the salamanders into the culverts, but it's a family event there. This is the most coddled population of spotted salamanders I'm aware of, because these are hand-carried animals that are brought gently by families to the vernal pool to breed. And like here in Atlanta, we also have spotted salamanders, but it's much more staggered, the migrations. There's not a punctuated big night like there is in New England, where you are in Maine, where they literally move on one night. And I witnessed that when I was an undergrad, and it made me the way I am, seeing those hundreds. I mean, in Massachusetts, they're migrating over the snow and slipping under the ice of a pond. I'm out there freezing. These salamanders seem excited, and it was just a very profound experience.
Hold on, I shot this in the Hudson Valley in January, and I think it was 2011. I was blown away by what I saw
here in January through the ice, and there's one.
Oh my goodness!
Here's where it is.
Wow!
Through the ice.
That's amazing.
It was pretty exciting.
I'm hoping to see if I could spot it.
There was multiple times I had
here in January through the
different
ice,
years.
There's one. Here's where it is.
So as I said, just look down. Do look down.
Yeah.
Don't
just look down.
So down.
Don't look up.
This forming ice.
No.
And I think scientists and communicators like all of you, the more people can tune into what you're doing and share the everyday wonder of North America's unbelievable biological bounty, the better chance we have of holding the tide back in this case, I think. So thank you for being on the show today. And Megan, any last thought from you or reading, anything you want to say to close things out? When you interact a lot with kids, and you're hoping the book obviously connects with kids too.
Yes, I'd encourage looking at buying the book and using it as a resource. It's really produced as a resource. It has the poem, it has Tuffy's true story, it has more about the broad scope of the extinction crisis. It has a section on lost species and found species. That something that's coming to the surface right now is Haiti. And several species, because of Robin Moore's inspiration and the search done there, they found 6 species within a week that had been lost. And so I guess a take home for me is to be inspired. As I was working on the book, I can't tell you how many times I was just in tears looking at even images of amphibians online. So spend time just exploring photographs of amphibians. I mean, they're magical. And yeah, I really hope that the book is of service in terms of the information it provides for further exploration. There's a class at the Friends School in Atlanta who is working with the book. Fourth graders and older are working with the book in a unit, and there's another class in Bloomington. And so hopefully there will be more feedback from there, which will feed information on the blog, and I'll be producing some content to also support further learning. But I really, you all are inspiring, and so as much as we can tap into what can be done, while being aware of the time we're in, right. We are in crisis mode. I'm going back to the graph that you shared, Andy, from one of the research articles where it was a pie chart, and half of amphibians are either critically endangered or extinct in that pie chart. And so it is a serious time. Yes, thank you. And there's so much that we can do and are doing. So let's get at it.
Well, this has been a pleasure. I know we were planning this for a while, and we can revisit these questions down the line when there are reasons to. And anyone who's watching, you can share this as soon as we're done. The link you're watching on, and even though it didn't run to Facebook today for some technical reason, I'm going to stream it there shortly. So it'll be on Facebook as well as LinkedIn and on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. And maybe I'm going to end with one last scene of the wonderment that's out there when you start to think about these animals. And this is kind of wild. It was on X. This is one of the amphibians that's not a salamander or a frog or a toad. So any last thoughts on this, Karen? What are we looking at here? Or do you know
this is the third group of amphibians that never gets quite as much attention or press. It's a Sicilian, and this is a brand new discovery. This is the mom and her babies, and this is a paper that describes how the babies eat in the early days, where mom is secreting a milk-like substance that the babies feed on, and it's directly from her body. So it's a really high-profile paper, and it's really super cool biology.
So there you go. There's discoveries abound all around the amphibians that we should definitely look down at and look up to. They're a key part of our world, as all this work that you're all doing demonstrates. This is Andy Revkin. This is the Sustain What webcast. Do go to revkin.substack.com, and I'll be posting a summary of this with some of the links to some of the papers and other content that we've been talking about. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.